Hello and welcome to Clarity for UPSC. I'm Dr. Shivin, and today is the first episode of this new series, Truth and Nothing But the Truth. We are here with Aniruddh Yadav, who is a dear friend from Lavasna. He is also All India Rank 8 in this year's UPSC examination. He is in the Indian Administrative Service in the Haryana cadre, and today he is here to talk to us about GS4. So, firstly, Aniruddh, thank you for being here, and a very warm welcome to you.
Hi, Shivin. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so just a little bit about Aniruddh. He is obviously an IAS in the Haryana cadre, and this was his fourth attempt. He's also been selected thrice in these four attempts. In this first attempt, he was in the Railway Personnel Service, then he was in the Information Service, and now he's in the Administrative Service. So, Aniruddh, we're just going to have a candid conversation about GS4 and anything that you want to share about that. So, as I understand, you've given three mains, and this has been your
Right.
experience. So, in 2019, you had scored 125, which in that year was, I would say, an average score because the top scores were close to like 140. And in 2020, it was 81, and now it was 119, which is a very good score for this year. So, what was the experience like, and what changes did you make in these years?
Right. So I think, like most people, I was quite lost when I started studying for GS4, the ethics paper, in my first attempt. And what I primarily did was that I just took the basic books that were available in the market. Lexicon was one of them. I took some notes from some coachings, and I went through all of them. Basically, I didn't have too much of a strategy. I just thought that because I was already overburdened with GS 1, 2, 3 and my optional, I thought that this is something I'll wing it in a sense. But I did go through the basic definitions and everything. And I did give about four papers in my first attempt, four practice papers. And I think this was somewhere reflected in my score also, which was pretty much average. And like you had said, that year, I mean, one of the best ethics answers, I think, so far in the history of the examination was by Vishakha Yadav, who was ranked sixth that year, Vishakha ma'am. And her papers are absolutely legendary in that sense. And she had scored about 164, if I remember correctly. In my second attempt, I changed my strategy a little bit. I tried to think a little out of the box and tried to be a lot more organic. I integrated some new things into my paper. For instance, I started using quotes a lot, and there was not too much structure in my answers. But I did feel that year that my paper went well, and unfortunately, this was not reflected in the score because 81 was not a good score at all that year, and this is why my overall marks were also pushed down significantly because of ethics that year. In 2022, I had a couple of years to prepare. So what I primarily did was that I realized that in ethics, my main learning was that what the coachings are basically doing and the way they are checking the papers, it has no real correlation with the marks that people are getting in the actual ethics examination. So based on that, I realized that the only bona fide source of what seems to work in ethics is the past year copies of people who have really done very well. And so what I did was I scrounged through the marks of all the toppers in the past 3, 4 years, and I went through almost all of their copies, and I tried to distill whatever information I could with regard to what works and what doesn't work. So basically, what I learned was that the use of examples is something that's very, very important. Overall, having a structure is very, very important. One thing that was a common theme across almost everyone who scored very good marks in ethics was that they were using keywords from the syllabus itself. For instance, the name of the paper itself is Ethics, Integrity, and Aptitude. It's not just ethics. So if we are structuring an answer just using these three keywords, I think will definitely increase your score a little more. Additionally, when we go on to the syllabus, we can see that there are various other terms such as efficiency in fund utilization, the contributions of moral thinkers across history, etc. And just going point by point according to the syllabus is something that I think really helped me.
राइट तो आपको लगा कि सिलेबस के टॉपिक्स यूज करके यू कुड लाइक जनरेट मोर पॉइंट्स and those keywords also fetched you, you think, more marks. And I think this was pretty interesting that you felt that with test series there was no correlation, because it's pretty similar to my experience. So I was scoring very well in the test series, but then my ethics marks have no correlation with what happened in the test series. So I think this is one thing that I probably could incorporate myself, where past year copies of toppers are something that we can look at.
Absolutely. And this was actually, I think, exemplified by the 2018 topper, Kanishk Kataria sir. I mean, one of his videos, he had said that he had scored, I think, He used to score between eight in the 80s in his test series, and he was not very optimistic, and he ended up scoring around 120, I think. So I think the overall coaching domain and their idea of what is correct in ethics is not necessarily correlated with what happens in UPSC.
Yeah, so I think we need to focus more on the past year copies, and they're also, I think, a more realistic way to understand what model answers could look like. Because if you're looking at, let's say, model answers of the coachings, they have like 800 words in an answer, and that's not something you can replicate. But when you're looking at a past year copy, that's something that जो किसने लिखा है वहाँ पे. So if that is written,
बिल्कुल
then that is something that you think that this is something that I could also do, right?
बिल्कुल एंड ऑल्सो वो टाइम का प्रेशर बिकॉज मतलब राइटिंग सो मच इन अ मैटर ऑफ 3 आवर्स उसमें there's only so much you can write.
Hmm.
मॉडल आंसर हमेशा कोई बहुत लिखेगा उसको देख के इफ एनीथिंग यू जस्ट गेट डिमोटिवेटेड.
Hmm. All right, so now let's move on to this question which I've encountered a lot, that when do you start studying for GS4? Like जैसे अभी it's we're in December right now. So is this the right time? Or should an aspirant first rather complete GS1, GS2, GS3 and then go for it? Or maybe it can be done after the prelims is done. So in your opinion, what is the best time to start studying GS4?
Right. So I think one to overall if someone is planning to give the main seriously and assuming कि आपका first attempt है, the entire main syllabus should be more or less complete before you write the prelims ideally. And one good thing about GS4 is कि उसका syllabus is not very difficult to cover compared to GS1, 2 and 3 जिसका काफी vast and expansive syllabus है. So GS4 में what you can do is I think it if you're seriously giving about 5 to 6 hours every day only to GS4, then you can complete it in about 20 days to 1 month. उससे ज़्यादा टाइम नहीं लगेगा. And I would also highly suggest to complete GS1, 2 and 3 before GS4 क्योंकि उसमें आप इंटरलिंकिंग बहुत कर सकते हो. तो whenever you're making your notes for GS4 उसमें जो एग्जाम्पल्स हो गए जो कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल प्रिंसिपल्स इफ यू आर ट्राइंग टू कोट अगर आपको कल्चर से या हिस्ट्री से कुछ लेना है तो लॉट ऑफ दैट रियली एड्स टू द वैल्यू यू ब्रिंग टू योर पेपर इन GS4. सो आइडियली मेरे हिसाब से GS4 शुड बी डन इन द एंड आफ्टर कंप्लीटिंग GS1, 2 and 3 एंड ऑल्सो योर ऑप्शनल बिकॉज ऑप्शनल्स में भी आप इतना डेप्थ में चले जाते हो. फॉर इंस्टेंस मेरा एंथ्रोपोलॉजी था तो a lot of ethical things a lot of things regarding ethics I learned from anthropology when I was reading about the different tribes, their different cultures, what they hold as more important in life, etc. तो आई थिंक अगर आपने अपना ऑप्शनल भी कर लिया उससे पहले तो उससे भी यू कैन ऐड अ लॉट स्पेशली इफ इट्स फ्रॉम द ह्यूमैनिटीज साइड.
Right. So let's say somebody is giving their the first attempt in 2025 and they are just starting out the prep. So you'd say that they first cover GS1 to 3 or at least cover some of the
राइट
subjects of GS1 to 3 like history, polity, because I think everywhere like world history and also subjects like society also proffer up a lot of examples that can be used in ethics. Right. So is
बिल्कुल
that an accurate understanding?
एब्सोल्युटली मतलब आई थिंक एवरीथिंग हैज एन एथिकल डायमेंशन. Anything that's going on in the news today also, for instance, right from the war that is the current issues that are going on in the Middle East to the Russia-Ukraine crisis that is going on. International relations is also something that's part of the syllabus in ethics also. उसके अलावा भी अभी the elections are upcoming. I'm sure a lot of ethical, a lot of things that have correlation with ethics will come over there. For instance, the MCC that is almost always in news. So I think doing GS1, 2, 3 and then doing GS4, may the context you develop is something that's a lot more beneficial.
Right. So the next question was how much time is needed. So I think you've more or less answered that. That in 1 month, if somebody is giving 5 to 6 hours, then it should be something that you should be able to do. But I think the main problem that people find here is that the sources are so many and so far in between that there's not only a gap between the cup and the lip, the cup and the lip are in different dimensions, so to speak, because every book has a different approach to it, and there are government reports also, and there is so much of cluttering. So I think we can move on to that, which is I think more important. That let's decode the syllabus and then look at the sources which we can study from, because everybody has some or the other different advice to give, right?
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
just to add, I mean, I think I was a victim of that. मतलब I had no idea कि syllabus कितना important होता है. या फिर आपको where are you supposed to study from, how do you write a case study for example, उसमें क्या अच्छा है क्या खराब है. So ethics में there's a lot of confusion in the market, and I think it's very very important to have at least some semblance of what is going on and what to do while studying for ethics.
Right. So there is basically a cluttered market. So what we'll do basically is first we'll look at the syllabus of GS4 and look at it point by point, and then we'll come back to sources that you have used and what you would recommend, right? So this is the GS4 syllabus. So let's go point by point, and you can tell me about, how you have approached every single part of it.
Absolutely. So largely, I think that one thing that's very important is that the paper, what we often call ethics, is actually ethics, integrity, and aptitude. And all three are equally important when you're writing any question. For instance, if someone's talking about transparency, or if someone's talking about public service in general, what is important in public service, then we must address these 3 points at least, because this is the title of the entire paper.
Right.
And apart from that, I mean, I think even the first line, it says that this paper will include questions to test the candidate's attitude and approach to issues relating to integrity, probity in public life, and his problem-solving approach to various issues and conflicts faced by him/her in dealing with society. So I think even the keywords over here are, for instance, attitude, the candidate's attitude, which will obviously be reflected in the paper. There are two very obvious keywords in integrity and probity that you have encircled. Problem solving approaches, again, one. Various issues and conflicts. I think that's very important, and that's something that is the basis of the case studies as a whole. Right.
Right. So let's start with the first, so to speak, syllabus point of ethics and human interface. So, as far as I understand it, this is basically something that is the most misunderstood, I feel, where people go into dimensions of what are ethics, what is applied ethics, what is meta ethics, environmental ethics, etc. And no questions are effectively asked from that. It's more about understanding the human values. This part I feel is pretty important. And so is this. So, what is something that one should
Absolutely.
understand from this part of the syllabus?
Right. I completely agree with you. But I think one important thing over here is that when someone is just starting out with the ethics paper, we're often very confused. Matlab, if you ask someone who's not read ethics that what is ethics, I was at a point where I couldn't answer that question without stumbling a few times. Difference between ethics, morals, etc. So I think particularly for this point, going by a standard book or any material that you have, not that it will help you in the paper as such, but I think definitely it will help you at least prime your brain for what comes next. So I think the essence, the determinants and consequences of ethics, this is something that's very theoretical. For instance, they'll say that ethics is something that's decided by the society. What are some examples of ethics? What is something that is ethical but not moral, and vice versa, and all of those permutations and combinations. And just going through all of this, one really understands what the essence of ethics is. And the determinants and consequences of ethics will be laid down very clearly in whatever book you read. And I think that should be about it.
Right.
And I think there's another very important line in the syllabus, which is in public and private relationships. Ethics in public and in private and public relationships. I feel that's very important because that also gives us a structure for any potential answer. If they're asking us for the value of transparency, like why transparency is important, so we can't just say transparency is important because of RTI or because the government in that way is more accountable to the people. In private life, it's also very important. Transparency builds trust, I feel, in any relationship, be it with your parents, with your significant other, etc. And this is something that must be addressed, I think, in questions also.
Right.
Moving on to the next part, human values, lessons from the lives and teachings of great leaders. I think this is a very, very important part of the syllabus. Human values is something that is just, I think there are questions every year, not just one, multiple. And the values, whatever values you note down, you study, you define very importantly, are also used in a lot of other questions, especially in case studies. So one thing that I remember I had done was that I took all the values that I could find, right, from hard work, integrity, discipline, transparency, accountability, honesty, everything, and I noted down 5 or 6 quotes on each and every human value. And before the exam, I obviously crammed all of these quotes, and they're extremely useful, not just in the ethics paper, sometimes also in the essay paper. And it was just, I think that really made a difference to my answer writing, because the person who's checking the paper can somewhere relate. Your answer is not mechanical, it brings a sort of human touch. And
Hmm.
when you are quoting someone, you're always quoting someone who's a great leader, a reformer, a great administrator, which is also basically the next part of the syllabus, which is lessons from the lives and teachings of leaders, reformers, and administrators.
Hmm.
I think the second dimension to this point in the syllabus is the fact that we can use examples. So this is something I'd learned by reading the toppers copies of previous years, where I saw that they use at least 5 or 6 examples in almost every question. So, for instance, if there's something on leadership, you can use examples from the life of Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam. You can use examples from the life of anyone that, for example, even Oppenheimer, because there was a movie on him. And when you use relevant examples that are more relatable to someone who's checking the paper, you will naturally score a lot more.
Right.
So
So
this base, yeah. No, no, please.
yeah, please go ahead.
I think this basically just builds the base of the overall answer writing that you'll do, and it just creates a lot more content for you to fill your answers based on this first point of the syllabus.
So the first point is mainly to get us an orientation, and
Right.
then the second, third, fourth points, they are where actual questions will be generated directly from the keywords.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So with that in mind, let's go to the second part, which is attitude. So elaborate about that, please.
Right. So I think in attitude, there is a certain amount of theoretical part that you have to do for the content, structure, and function. So I wouldn't suggest that anyone go into a great depth about what the content, structure, and function is, but just have a basic 1 or 2 pages of notes as to what it is. And I think attitude is something that's very overarching in the whole paper. And for instance, I mean, even for attitude, I put this in the same place where I put things like transparency, etc. And I just had a bunch of notes about attitude, which included a lot of lessons from the lives and also a lot of quotes. So whenever you're talking about attitude, the question will always be related to something else, and the question will almost never be only about attitude. So when you're writing a question, you can use attitude as a subheading. For instance, in case studies, you can, if you're the SP or the write what is the attitude I'll have, then you might be able to supplement that to the quote and write 2, 3 things about the attitude that a person has. That the attitude should be optimistic, that the attitude should not be defeatist, that the attitude should be aggressive or submissive based on the situation. And so I think this is something that supplements a lot of points in a particular question. Very, very, I think infrequently questions asked from attitude itself. They
Hmm.
might ask what's the importance of attitude, etc. But that's a very basic question, and I think there's very little scope for innovation in those questions.
Maybe when they ask, the questions are somewhat like political attitudes of the youth. Like there's a derivation
Right.
to every attitude question generally.
Absolutely, and I think that is a question where you can really show your lateral thinking. You can, for instance, in political attitude, we can pick up examples from GS2. We can always have examples from history. We have had great leaders in our country itself who had a tremendous attitude towards the way they express their political leanings. So I think that is just the lateral thinking part and how you sort of weave together what you already know.
All right, so let's move on to the third part now, where we're talking about aptitude and foundational values. I think this is a question
Right. So
that,
just yeah. So just before we move on to that, I think the last line, social influence and persuasion. So this is also a separate part, and this is something that I think is very, very relevant, especially in case studies. So, for instance, in most case studies, you will have to write how social influence and persuasion is done. And just to give an example, I think there's a very common approach to this part of the syllabus where people use the logos, ethos, and pathos part that was given by, I think, Aristotle.
hmm,
And so, what I did was that I researched a bit more on this, and I found something that was given in the Indian scriptures, which was Sam, Dan, Dand, Bhed. So
Hmm.
that is also something you can incorporate. And when you incorporate something that is unique, you can, or something that comes from our own culture and history, I think it certainly adds a lot more value.
Right. So, moving on now to the next part of the syllabus, which is aptitude and foundational values. And I think we see a question from this every year where they're asking about the
Yeah,
prospective values of a civil servant, etc. So, what is the approach for this part of the syllabus?
right. So I think for aptitude, there five keywords are already, I mean, more than five keywords are already given. So basically, just having enough content on all of these words, because a lot of times what they do is that they'll write something like, what do you think are the key aptitudinal frameworks that are required for a civil servant? And the answer to a lot of that is already given in the syllabus itself. And basically, what we have to do is, I think we have to supplement what we are writing with more examples, with more relevant quotes, etc., in the paper itself. And this is primarily, I think, the framework for most of the 10 markers that we write for ethics, unless it's very, very specific about an issue.
Hmm.
And so I think almost every year we'll see that what are the top 10 values you think for a civil servant and all of that. And most of the answers to that is already given over here. One important thing over here, I think, is that one must define each and every word. For instance, integrity, impartiality, non-partisanship, objectivity. Like one should be able to differentiate between what is objectivity, what is non-partisanship, what is. So a lot of these words are often very common. Accountability, transparency, often used interchangeably also. So one must be very, very clear as to what each of these words mean. One must have two or three real world examples of these things, either from history or from the present context up their sleeve. And if possible, even a couple of quotes or whatever other value add you can do.
Right. So now let's move on to emotional intelligence. This is something I feel which is very important both for part A and part B because generally they can see questions in part A also. And almost in every case study, some or the other application of emotional intelligence is relevant. So how do you
So
approach
true.
this part?
So I think for this part, I use Google a lot. And there's this very famous person by the name of Daniel Goleman, I think,
Hmm.
who has written extensively about emotional intelligence. So most of everything that I had was based on his work. And apart from that, I think some people, I remembered a couple of quotes and a couple of examples from the life of Marcus Aurelius and his books. So those were also important. And if you just read a little bit of, I think, everything that happened in ancient Greece and Daniel Goleman, that should largely be enough.
Right. Coming
And
to,
additionally,
yeah.
yeah. So additionally, also what happens is that we will see examples of people using emotional intelligence in everyday life, especially when we are reading the newspaper. So there might be a case where a particular SP, ASP, inspector, DC, DM, SDM, whatever, they use their emotional intelligence to make sure that a situation does not cascade into something that's problematic for the district. And so we can use a lot of these examples in our paper as well, but we just need to keep our eyes and ears open that whenever we're reading the newspaper or seeing the news anywhere, we can correlate it to this part of the paper.
Right. Coming next to this next part, which is contributions of moral thinkers and philosophers. This is something I did not understand properly. So when I was starting my prep, I thought this is something that has to be done in a lot of detail. So I think I read up in way too much detail than what was required. Like I was reading about the allegory of the cave, etc. Which then I later, after I looked at the paper, I found out it's not something that's needed to be done at all. So where
Right.
exactly do you put the foundations for this?
Right. So I think the basic of the entire paper and something that I had learned from the toppers of past years is the fact that simplicity is the ultimate sophistication when it comes to the ethics paper. That the simpler you are, the I mean, if you go into the depths, for instance, you said the allegory of the cave, and if you go into words like utilitarianism, also, I mean, something that seems basic for someone who's studying ethics, but we don't know the level of the people who are checking the paper. So I think just keeping it very, very simple is important. So, for instance, if you're doing something on someone like Mahatma Gandhi, then we can just note down the five or six main contributions and ideas that he had, which are Sarvodaya, Ahimsa, truthfulness, etc. And as long as we keep it limited to that, I think it should be good enough. So we don't have to go into extensive depth about everyone for each and every thinker, but we should have a general idea of what people have said. So, for instance, if someone has stood for something like truthfulness, and someone like Nelson Mandela or Martin Luther King or Gandhiji, then one should be aware that they've stood for truthfulness and use their examples in questions on honesty and truthfulness. So I think that is something that's very, very important. So,
Right. So
like I think the
yeah.
point on that also, this supplements other questions a lot.
So we basically have to understand the most important value that someone has stood for. And then from here, we have to also use them in other examples because I think, again, in case studies, etc., this can become a good feeder for what we're writing.
Absolutely.
Right. So for the last two parts of the syllabus, what we'll do is we'll just combine these two because I feel there's at least some similarity in how it's also linked to the governance part of GS2. So for the last two
Absolutely.
parts, which is civil service values as well as probity in governance, could you just tell us an overall approach to this part of the syllabus?
So, like you said, I mean, most of the things like RTI, etc., was something I already done in GS2. So, and for instance, I think a lot of the words over here are not something that one can study as such. For instance, in the public slash civil service values and ethics in public administration, the things about laws, rules, regulations, etc., there are always questions on it, but you can't really prepare for it. So, I think absolutely one source that you just can't skip is the second ARC report of ethics in public administration. And that basically, I think these two parts of points of the syllabus have basically been picked up from that. The probity and governance part has basically been taken up from the second ARC report. Each and every point of this syllabus, right from citizen charter to RTI, transparency, information sharing, to the word probity itself, has been taken from the second ARC report. And this is something that one must do, especially for these 2 points of the syllabus. And the second ARC report doesn't only have, I mean, theory, it also has some examples.
Hmm.
And there have been instances where questions have been directly picked up. So,
Hmm.
for instance, I think in 2016, there was a question on the seven sins of Gandhiji. So,
Hmm.
that is given in a box in the second ARC report. And I highly suggest that do not read any summary of the report by any coaching institute. Just read the report. It's
Hmm.
the single most authoritative source for the paper that is available anywhere.
Also, I'd just like to recommend that if anybody wants to read a summary, the second ARC itself has published a summary at the end of that page. If you go to scroll down that page, like if you absolutely must read a summary, read the summary that the government has given rather than going for somebody else's understanding of how the content can be best summarized. So from there, let's move on to your approach and how you've made notes, right? So we've already know that you've read the second ARC report. What else have you used here to?
Right. So I've actually uh, experimented a lot with my ethics preparation. In my first attempt, like I had said, I'd read books like Lexicon and a couple of mainstream coaching material, which I didn't think was very helpful. I wasn't confident. I wasn't particularly well prepared for what was happening. And I would not suggest this to anyone. I think what one should ideally do is that after reading the syllabus and going through it, and perhaps just having a cursory reading of the material, one should definitely take up the past 10 years or 7, 8 years, the question papers from the past 7, 8 years, and go through them properly. Even if it takes about 4 or 5 hours, just do it as well as possible, just to understand what UPSC means when they say that we're having an ethics paper. So I think that's most important. And once you start doing that, and once you've read the papers exhaustively, the next time you go down to any book or you're searching online on Google or even just reading the newspaper, you will start correlating stuff that you are reading to the questions that have been asked in the past. So I think this will give anyone a very, very good direction as to what to note down, given the abstract nature of the paper, what to note down, what is important, what is not important, etc. And I think the second part of the approach comes when you start writing your answers, because unlike GS1, 2, and 3, this paper is not objective at all. There's no right or wrong answer. And structuring the answers itself becomes very difficult. So when we go to that part, I think, like I had said before, reading the toppers copies from the previous years will really help you make a structure for your answer. So, for instance, I remember reading someone's paper where they had, I think, 3 or 4 points that they were using again and again in every question. And all of these were taken from the syllabus itself. For instance, they would write, what is the relevance of XYZ ethic in public life and private life? What is the relevance in public administration? What great thinkers and leaders from the world and history have said about this ethic? And lastly, they'll conclude with some relevant case study or relevant example or relevant quote or something, and they'll finish their answer. And I think they were one of the top 3 or 4 scorers in their year. So I think just having an overall structure as to how you would write, and given that ethics is something that comes organically, one should always not be hesitant to innovate. Whatever fresh approach that you can bring to the paper is certainly something that will work. And given that no one really knows what works in a paper like ethics, you should definitely not be afraid to innovate.
Right. And for everybody who's watching, I'd also like to let you know, because since I've also faced this problem of this multiple sources in the market. For example, I've read Lexicon, I've read Subbarao's book, I've also read Decode GS4, and still managed to score less than my first attempt in my second attempt. So of course there is a sources problem. So just letting everyone know that Aniruddh is also coming out with the compilation of GS4, which will be a compilation of his notes in a book format, which will be, I think, released in January, if I'm not wrong. So if somebody's interested, you can check that out too. But again, I would say that the way he has mentioned the second ARC report, try and go through that yourself. But if you need something to supplement that, you can check that out.
Additionally, I think that YouTube and overall just Google is a very, very good source for understanding different words, different concepts. And because if you look for a video on YouTube, I think there's a very good channel. I can't remember the name. They do these short animated videos on almost every ethic that one can think of, and they'll give you some historical context. They'll give you some story. They might even talk about a couple of great leaders. And when you watch a video, it tends to stay in your mind a lot longer. So just try to explore as much as you can. And additionally, I think one very good book that I had found was, I think, BK Balaji. He has written a book on ethics only, and the book is just replete with examples. I wouldn't recommend it for theory, but there are so many examples in that book that you can just find examples on anything and everything. Although they
Right.
are a bit dated, but if you can't find something for, say, for instance, integrity or transparency or whatever, that book is just replete with examples and it's very, very useful.
Another YouTube channel that one can look at is the School of Life. They also have these short videos on many philosophers like Aristotle, Plato, and will come up with a lot of examples if in case you're short on those. Right.
Also, I think if someone's into the habit of book reading and if that is their hobby, then I think there's nothing better than reading books. For instance, there's a book that I think that's recommended also almost officially, that is Justice by Michael Sandel. If
Hmm.
someone doesn't have the patience, time to read that book, there's also a set of videos that
Hmm.
Michael Sandel has given that basically everything. He starts from the trolley problem, etc. And that is something that you can start with. And if you're generally in the habit of reading, then whatever book you'll read, as long as it's not fiction and something that's non-fiction, you'll find some or the other example that you can relate to ethics.
Right. So, coming now to the next part, which is once you've, let's say, covered the syllabus, read it. So, how many tests should one think of? And when do you say that, okay, now I'm, you know, confident in my ethics answer, especially because the marking that the means test series is giving you is, as you said, is not reliable and not correlated with how you're going to score.
Right. So I think this holds true for, I think, GS 1, 2, and 3 also, and even perhaps optional. I think the main, why would someone write a test? I think there are about 3 reasons. One is, I mean, just the confidence of whether or not you can complete a test on time. Second is that whether or not you are happy with what you have written in terms of presentation, in terms of handwriting, in terms of how many minutes you've given to every question, and I third is time management. So I think overall these are the 3 things that one should work on. And so for someone to reach to tick all of these 3 boxes or 4 boxes, they might take about 10 tests or 20 tests, and for other people this might just happen in 3 or 4 tests, depending, because everyone is different in that way. So as soon as you think that you've written a paper and you can write like papers consistently that largely tick all of these boxes, you're confident that you will finish the paper in time. You're confident that there is no question that will stump you. You're confident that no matter what the case study is, you will be able to write 4 or 5 pages with relevant answers. And you think that the presentation that you're doing, making diagrams that you've probably practiced earlier, etc., and the fact that you can recall definitions, examples, quotes, everything, once you are at that level and you yourself feel that, okay, I'm not improving too much, no matter how many more tests I write, is I think the overall saturation point. But unfortunately, I think the problem over here is that no one is ever happy with their tests.
Hmm.
So it's
Right.
almost always a race against time, that you always undermine yourself and you think, okay, I'm not good enough right now. I can do more. I can do more. So I think in the end, if I were to come up with a number, I would say between 4 and 8 tests between prelims and mains is something that should be adequate, especially if it's your first time writing mains. Apart from that, I think what one can also do is just, even if you're writing half a test, you can just do 10, the 13 10 markers or the 6 case studies in one day, and just make sure that you're completing it on time and completing it to the best of your satisfaction if you don't have the time to write 4 to 8 tests.
Right. So, having answered that, what we'll do now is I have a small surprise for you. So, since you've already told us and काफी ज्ञान दे चुका है, so now what I'll ask Aniruddh to do is to write a couple of answers himself from this year's paper. So you don't have to write the entire answer, and we're anyway running slightly short on time. So what we'll do is we'll look at 2 questions from this year's paper, and just tell us sight unseen what your approach is, what are you thinking as soon as you look at the question, so that somebody who is, let's say, studying ethics for the first time understands how a question is to be broken down, right?
Right.
So let's go to this year's paper, and this is the first question that I selected. So I'll just read the question
You're
out.
putting you're putting me on the spot. I haven't revised it all. I mean, and it's been a while since I studied
Yeah,
it. But
no, I
okay, I'll try
understand.
my best.
I understand that. So just can tell us a basic approach to how this you would approach this looking at it for the first time. So what really matters for success, character, happiness, and lifelong achievements is a definite set of emotional skills, your emotional quotient, not just purely
Right.
cognitive abilities that are measured by conventional IQ tests. Do you agree? And give reasons. So just in a couple of minutes, or just an idea of what you think your approach would be to this.
Right. So I think right off the bat, I think understanding what the question itself is, because that is something that's often confusing in ethics. There are 2 parts of the question. Do you agree with this view, and give reasons to support in support of your answer. So most of your answer, about 80%, should focus on these 2 issues, which should be equally divided. So this is something that will certainly maximize your marks. And the question itself is really, I mean, it's not particularly difficult to understand. They're just saying that is, how is EQ important, and how is it, I mean, how is EQ and IQ together perhaps better than just IQ as a metric of success, happiness, character, or whatever it is. So I think we start off by defining what emotional quotient is, obviously. And we can obviously write what Daniel Goleman had said, that he had said something about how EQ is overall something that will, like, IQ is something that might bring you success, but EQ is something that will help you sustain it or retain it. Something along these lines. There's a very good quote by Daniel Goleman. And then we can write this. This can be the introduction of the question. Then we can go on to, do you agree with this view? So I think certainly, I mean, I don't think anyone would particularly disagree with this view. So in the agreement, we can write examples. And we have seen a lot of examples where we have seen that, one thing that comes to my mind right off the bat is that we see so many cases of suicide in institutions of importance, like in eminent institutions like IIT, AIMS, or all of the big colleges, not just in India, but across the world. We see so many cases of people having burnouts when they're working after IIM, after Harvard, etc., in those areas. And I think, so. This is something that you can. This could be one point of what you're writing. We can also take things from history. For instance, we have seen, or from the present context, we have seen that a lot of uh, leaders in the world were not particularly good students. Albert Einstein is the first person that comes to mind. That person also had an exceptional IQ, but they were not exactly successful initially in their career. And we have also seen a lot of people who, just by their emotional quotient, especially a lot of politicians, using their emotional intelligence, they became very successful despite not having the quote unquote measures of success or IQ for that matter. Apart from that, I think it's also very important to give the counterpoint that we're not saying that IQ is not a good metric. We're just saying that EQ and IQ together are better than IQ only. So we can give examples of people like APJ Abdul Kalam, who was very successful in what he did, and IQ is something that definitely helped him. We've also seen a lot of people like from history. One can think of Isaac Newton, who didn't have too much EQ, but his IQ was enough. So it's not that IQ is not important, but this is also important. And basically, what does EQ really give you? EQ allows you to have empathy, to have compassion. It is particularly relevant in leadership, in public administration, when you're trying to motivate people to do better work. Basically, which was part of the introduction, wherein why EQ is important and what Daniel Goleman has said about it. And so I think these are pretty much the reasons also that EQ is important, because it makes you a better leader, it makes you a better communicator, it helps you motivate people. And overall, whatever work you're doing, if you are only working on your IQ, you're working alone. And if you're combining IQ and EQ, you can really have a multiplier effect. And I think for this, I remembered a quote by Marcus Aurelius, which was that only when we can conquer a mind can we conquer the world, something along these lines.
Hmm.
So we can conclude with something like that, which really sort of completes the answer, I think.
So I think that gives a very good example of how you're supposed to handle a question and how you're supposed to think about it. I think that probably would have given you another question, but we are running slightly short on time. So I think we'll go back to the video, and I'll just like to thank you very much for your time, for being here, and
No problem.
and for being
My
so
pleasure.
candid, and for being so candid and forthcoming. So before you go, just a huge thank you from everyone who's watching. On their behalf, I'd just like to thank you. And if you have any message to anyone who's watching, that would be really appreciated.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, as someone who studied for over 4 years for this examination, I can probably relate with a lot of things that aspirants go through. Most of the time, it is uncertainty about the future. It is ki hoga ki nahi hoga, am I capable, insecurities, etc. All of that. But one thing I realized was that as long as you can keep your head down and keep working, even if you have all these thoughts in your head, somewhere or the other it pays off in the end. I think
Hmm.
most of the people that I know very much capable of clearing the exam, and a lot of people who had the capacity, capability, everything,
Hmm.
they just got lost in thinking that the exam is not fair or UPSC is very random, etc. Which it is. I'm not saying that that's not true, but if you do put in the hard work for whatever time that is required, it surely pays off in the end. I mean, the improvements are incremental, sure, but it does certainly pay off. And whoever's serious about writing the examination and serving this country, I would highly suggest that you don't lose hope if this is your first, second, third, whatever attempt. And if you're a fresher, definitely use all the optimism you have and just go for it.
All right, Aniruddh, thank you for your time. And we'll be happy to have you back here someday for anthropology as well.
Absolutely.
All right.